This week, we're going to talk about a set of disorders, a set of mental health conditions in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that are somewhat controversial.
Right, and that we haven't talked about before.
And we haven't talked about them before.
New territory for us.
It is, and this we're talking about it this week because we actually received an email from a listener asking about this specific class of disorders. And these are the dissociative disorders.
Right, we keep seeing this. It's becoming... It's a question that's coming up more and more. You know, patients will come in. I think I have dissociative disorder. Of course, they've gone to the internet and done some of their own research, and think that they have some of these characteristics, and so they come in wanting to know if perhaps that's what they have.
Right.
So it's becoming more common.
It is, and we're going to talk about it in much the same sort of format structure that we've talked about other conditions. But this one is a little bit, again, it's a little bit more challenging only because it's a relatively rare, pretty rare condition.
Right.
And it's a bit controversial.
Right. Controversial is the operative word here, because while less common than most of the disorders we talk about, we talk about ADHD, we're talking about 10% or more, you know, even autism spectrum disorders. This is about a 1% prevalence rate.
Right.
Still a large number of people, but a small prevalence rate, 1%. The problem is it's so controversial. Number one, it's controversial, and it's controversial because it's so complicated.
Right.
Okay, there are so many pieces to this,
Right.
and it's an easy. I think it's an easy diagnosis to make. No, it's an easy misdiagnosis to make. Would be more to the point. It's easy to hear this story that a person would bring in, and it would be easy to either arrive at a diagnosis faster than you should, or miss the diagnosis altogether.
Right.
Okay. So the operative word here is complex. It's a complex diagnosis.
Absolutely. And so we're going to start out today just kind of scratching the surface a little bit as to what dissociative disorders are and how they're different than some of the other things that they are often confused with. And then we'll get into more of the prevalence and causes and some of that stuff as the week progresses.
Some of the more details, clinical details.
Right. So when we're talking about dissociative disorders, we're talking about there's a couple of really specific conditions within this family of disorders, and they include things like dissociative identity disorder, dissociative amnesia, depersonalization disorder, and some of those kinds of things. And dissociative identity disorder, used to be, once was called multiple personality disorder. It hasn't been called that in a long time. I think it was 1994 when DSM-4 came out that they changed it to the dissociative identity disorder. But yet there are many people who still refer to it as multiple personality.
Well, this is, of all of this whole area, this is the one that's gotten the most popular exposure. It's the one you see on TV and movies and all
Lots
that.
Lots of movies about it.
It's such a interesting and intriguing topic to talk about.
Well, it makes me think of, and I didn't think about it until just now, but we should I'm sure you haven't seen the movie Split.
I have not. Can you imagine?
Go figure. But that would be that's a great movie that involves dissociative identity disorder. It's an M. Night movie.
M.
Night Shyamalan, I think is how you pronounce his last name. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting movie. But it's about...
he's from Austin, I think.
He's what?
I think he's... No, that's... No, different person. He was from Austin. Anyway.
I don't know.
But the word... So the first thing we want to do is say, let's get rid of this multiple personality disorder. I mean, it's an interesting cocktail party, dorm room kind of conversation. But as with many of these diagnoses, they have changed over time. This one changed in '94 with the publication of DSM-4, where it was described. The operative word here is dissociative. Okay, and the thing about dissociative disorders is that we all have this experience. Most of us have experienced a form of dissociation. And the simplest is daydreaming. Or when you're working on something and you sort of get caught up in what you're doing and you lose touch with everything going on. It could be that you're watching something on TV, or you're involved in a project, or, I used to do, people who like painting, it just, you describe it as, well, I was just transported.
It's what people call flow.
Flow is another way to put it. When Michael Jordan would play basketball, he would get into this zone, and they don't quite understand it. I remember certain pitchers talk about it, is that they just get into this zone, and they dissociate from everybody else or everything else, right? And they're sort of in their own world, if you will.
And it's sort of the phenomenon when we say, time flies when you're having fun. So you're doing something, and then suddenly, 2 or 3 hours have gone by, and it's like, oh my gosh, where did all that time go? That's a bit of dissociative types of symptoms.
Or you're in another city. Like here we drive. Florida, it's easy to drive. So we're in Tampa, which is about 30 miles away. And suddenly you're in Lakeland and you don't remember anything about the trip. Right. That's dissociation. So we've all experienced it in one form or another. But that's not a disorder. Okay. We also experience bouts of depression, but we're not depressed. We all become anxious, but we don't have an anxiety disorder. And so it is with dissociation. We've all had the experience. We don't have the disorder.
Yeah. So what makes these different, of course, as is always the case, is a level of dysfunction. And what happens with dissociative disorders is that the person experiences these this missing time or these situations where they are doing things that they can't remember doing or can't account for, and it often leads to them having some problems. Right.
But if we go back to the idea about the drive, if people don't know the geography here, or you may not know the geography, but as you approach Lakeland, you go through a little town called Plant City. If somebody were to ask me, what were you doing when you drove through Plant City, I would not be able to tell you, because I don't even remember driving through. I mean, I know I did, but it's not a memory. I don't have any memory for it. And that's one of the memory deficits that people with the disorder. But if you're missing important parts of your life that you'd like to remember, there was no reason for me to remember that, because it wasn't significant. But there are things that I do want to remember, and if you don't remember important events, then it becomes a functional deficit.
Yeah, if you came to work and you saw patients all day, and then you don't remember seeing patients by the end of the day, then that's a problem.
That would be we'd probably put that under the column of significant. I'm thinking of a surgeon saying, now what do I do? You have somebody's chest cavity open. You say, let me think now, what am I supposed to do next? That would be a functional impairment for everybody. That's right. What are we doing here? That would be that's what we talk about with impairment. That when it interferes with important parts of your life, then it becomes a functional impairment.
Absolutely.
That's what moves you to a disorder, not experiencing the symptoms, but moving to a disorder.
Yeah. So it's not, just to mention a few things that it's not, because they do often get confused. Because dissociative identity disorder was once called multiple personality disorder, one of the common misconceptions is that this is a personality disorder.
Yeah, or that you have to have other personalities. That you have to, people assume that if I have this, it means I have multiple personalities, and it doesn't mean that. It's broader than that.
It's a little bit broader than that, and so it's not a personality disorder. It's in a category all of its own. But it's also not, or it's often commonly confused incorrectly with schizophrenia, psychotic disorders. There's that, what's that little meme, like, I'm schizophrenic and so am I. That's...
Is that a meme?
Yeah, I know, it's okay. But schizophrenia means split brain. It doesn't mean split personality. And so it is a different, psychotic disorders are different from dissociative disorders.
That's right. A psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia, you have hallucinations, you have a break from reality. But I think split brain is the best differentiation. It's not split personality, it's split brain. This is also not a personality disorder,
right.
because in personality disorder, you don't have these other symptoms that we talk about with dissociative.
Right.
The other key element differentiating dissociative disorders from others is the idea of trauma.
Right.
Okay. Schizophrenia is a genetic disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You inherit these characteristics, these brain characteristics. Dissociative disorders are trauma-based.
Right.
They are an attempt to shield yourself from some part of your life that you simply can't face.
Right. Right.
So it's what Freud called a defense mechanism.
Right.
You know, we talk about defense mechanisms. So dissociative disorders are trauma-based. Mm-hmm. And the other thing to remember when patients come in and they say, I think I have this, you may well have some of the characteristics that would not be unusual. However, without trauma, and I've seen a couple of patients who thought they might have it, but there's no evidence of trauma in their lives, then that moves you toward something else and away from dissociative disorders.
And we'll talk more about that on, I believe, Wednesday as we get into some of the causes and triggers and all of dissociative disorders. But the key thing here is, again, that we're not talking about a psychotic disorder. We're not talking about a personality disorder. We're not talking about not really even a neurological disorder, because one of the disorders that we'll talk about, one of the subtypes or types of dissociative disorders is dissociative amnesia. And you know, we often associate amnesia with a brain injury, for example. And this is not a brain injury. It is more associated with sort of a psychological or trauma-based injury that causes the dissociative amnesia. Again, we'll get more into that later this week.
Right.
So,
and don't you think another issue here is that with the dissociative disorders, if you have either a split personality or a different personality state, and it could be either, the difference is that personality takes over, and it affects your behavior. Whereas in personality disorders, you really don't have that taking over.
Your personality is your personality all the time.
This is the person you are. That's how we describe it. This is a characterological difference or a characterological flaw. But this is how you are all the time. Whereas in dissociative disorder, the personalities, not only do they make themselves known, but they actually take over and control your behavior. That's another difference here that we're looking for.
Absolutely. So, all right. But again, we're going to get more into some of this as the week goes by. We will, but it's just important that to recognize that this is a unique class of conditions, a unique class of disorders that are different than some of the things that they're commonly associated or confused with. And so as we go through the week talking about some of the symptoms and causes and assessment and treatment and all of these conditions, they are different than what we talk about with many of the other disorders.
But this really has to be taken apart and parsed out, because there's so much confusion surrounding it. It's a confusing diagnosis to begin with. It's not an easy diagnosis to make. It's easy to make a mistake. It's a very complex set of characteristics or symptoms or features, and professionals need to be very, very careful when they wade into this area, because it's easy to be misled. It's easy to make mistakes, but individuals who think they might have this need to be careful as well, because as we said at the beginning of the podcast, we all have these characteristics, but it doesn't mean you have this particular disorder.
Absolutely.
Okay? Relatively new, 1994, that we really redefined it. So we're even the professional community is still learning their way through this.
And we'll talk a little bit about some of the classic cases later on in the week, like Eve. The classic case of Eve, which is from some time ago, 70s, 80s.
That was a movie, all about Eve.
But there was the Faces of Eve. That's it.
Faces of Eve.
Yeah, she's a. There was a real person. But we'll talk about that later this week. So, all right. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.